Welcome to The Explainer. So glad you're here, because today we're tackling one of the most absolutely fascinating, complex, and honestly intensely debated stories in human history, the foundational history of the United States. And look, we're not just going to run through a boring list of dates and dusty old documents. No way. Instead, we're going to look at this whole era as a relentless cycle of expansion, conflict, and the incredible friction of progress. It's the story of how an entire continent was completely transformed and exactly why those early growing pains still matter so much to us today. Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We've got 6 chapters today: Clash of Two Worlds, Rebellion and Independence, Forging a New Government, Manifest Destiny and Expansion, A Nation Divided, and finally, Reconstruction and the West. Basically, we've taken 400 years of incredibly dense history and structured it right down into these 6 digestible parts. Chapter 1: Clash of Two Worlds, the Friction of First Contact. So, long before European explorers started crossing the Atlantic looking for, faster trade routes to India and rich resources, the North American continent was already home to hundreds of thousands of people. Native American societies had these highly complex, sophisticated systems of government and culture that had been thriving for literally thousands of years before a single European sail was ever spotted on the horizon. But man, the second those sails did arrive, everything changed. This timeline really compresses a massive era of early colonization. Right after Columbus in 1492, you've got European powers, Spain, France, England, the Dutch, just in this frantic race for dominance. We see the Spanish setting up St. Augustine, the English surviving disease and starvation in Jamestown, and then the Puritans establishing Plymouth. And these arrivals brought European diseases that absolutely ravaged native communities, sparking these complex, sometimes cooperative, but very often violently destructive relationships with local tribes. Now, I want to pause on this number for a second. 2 million. As the colonies grew and their agricultural economies boomed, the demand for cheap labor skyrocketed, and that fueled the grotesque triangle trade. Between 1751 and 1775 alone, over 2 million enslaved Africans were imported to the Americas. It is just a staggering, devastating human cost that became completely woven into the fabric of the New World's economy. And meanwhile, these growing colonies weren't just fighting local battles. They were constantly getting dragged into global imperial conflicts. From King Philip's War all the way to the French and Indian War, it was like a giant chessboard, pitting European powers and their Native American allies against one another. The result? Native populations were decimated even further. And by 1763, Great Britain had pretty much cemented its absolute dominance over North America. Chapter 2: Rebellion and Independence, the breaking point. So, the British win the French and Indian War, right? But it came at a massive cost. To pay off that astronomical war debt, the British government looks over at their booming, independent-minded American colonies, which by now had grown to over 1 million people, and basically decides, hey, it's time you foot the bill. Now, what's really interesting about this is that those early taxes like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act weren't actually exorbitantly high. The real issue was that the colonists had zero voice in the British Parliament. No taxation without representation became the massive rallying cry. Tensions just boiled over in these explosive moments, like the Boston Massacre in 1770, where a panicked clash between 300 to 400 angry colonists and British soldiers left 5 Americans dead. And that set the stage perfectly for the intolerable acts. What started as a simple colonial tax rebellion evolved fast. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Read that with some energy, right? Because with those words, penned mostly by Thomas Jefferson, the whole thing shifted from a squabble over money into a full-fledged ideological revolution for self-rule. Let's zoom out and trace the military arc here. After the infamous shot heard round the world, you've got this ragged continental army, led by George Washington, that somehow has to defeat the world's greatest empire. I mean, it's wild. But through sheer endurance, brilliant tactical risks, like crossing the Delaware River in a blinding nor'easter to attack Trenton, and crucial victories like Saratoga that actually brought the French in as allies, the Americans outlasted the British. It all culminated in Cornwallis surrendering at Yorktown. Chapter 3: Forging a New Government, a Fragile Experiment. Winning the war was really only half the battle, and building a brand new nation from scratch, incredibly precarious. That first government under the Articles of Confederation was, well, disastrously weak.
The federal government couldn't manage trade, they couldn't levy taxes effectively. It led to absolute financial chaos. I mean, think about Shays' Rebellion, where unpaid Revolutionary War veterans actually occupied a Massachusetts courthouse.
To fix this mess, they called a new constitutional convention in 1787, and this sparked the intense debate that pretty much defined American politics. On one hand, you had the Federalists arguing for a strong central government to keep the whole thing from falling apart. On the other side, the Anti-Federalists, who were terrified of federal overreach and fought fiercely to protect individual state autonomy.
So the crucial point is that they had to compromise. And the Constitution they came up with elegantly divided power into three distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. This whole system of checks and balances was designed specifically to prevent any one branch, or let's face it, any one tyrant, from gaining way too much control.
And speaking of preventing tyranny, we absolutely have to talk about George Washington's ultimate legacy. Yes, he won the war. Yes, he navigated crazy early crises like the Whiskey Rebellion, but his most vital act? Simply stepping down. By willingly surrendering power after 2 terms, he proved to the world that this fragile experiment was going to be a true democracy, not a dynasty. Chapter 4: Manifest Destiny and Expansion, the Rush West. As we roll into the 19th century, this entire era is defined by the fervent, almost evangelical belief that the United States was uniquely destined to stretch across the whole continent, from sea to shining sea. And the speed of this expansion? Just breakneck. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the country literally overnight with the Louisiana Purchase. Then, through the Texas Revolution and the Mexican-American War, the U.S. secures these vast southwestern territories, including California, right in time for the 1849 gold rush. Fast forward to 1869, and a golden spike completes the Transcontinental Railroad, taking a perilous months-long journey and cutting it down to under a week. But, we cannot look at this era without facing this number. Following the 1830 Indian Removal Act signed by Andrew Jackson, tens of thousands of Native Americans were forcibly displaced from their ancestral homes. And on that horrific journey west, known as the Trail of Tears, roughly 15,000 Native Americans died. And this brilliantly illustrates the deep juxtaposition of the era. On one hand, you have this romanticized ideal, pioneers braving the Oregon Trail, incredible economic booms, the famed Pony Express, racing mail across the country. But the reality? The violent displacement of native tribes. And, critically, this mounting, inescapable political crisis over whether all these massive new territories would allow slavery. Chapter 5: A Nation Divided, the Irrepressible Conflict. So every single time a new Western territory was added to the map, that fragile political balance in Congress between free states and slave states was tested. It was like a pressure cooker, and eventually the tension threatened to just snap the country right in two. Despite all those compromises in Congress, the reality on the ground was boiling over into a really bloody path to war. You had Harriet Tubman heroically leading people to freedom on the Underground Railroad, violent proxy wars erupting in bleeding Kansas, a senator literally being beaten with a cane on the Senate floor, and John Brown's armed raid on Harper's Ferry. Finally, after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, Southern states seceded and Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter. The result, of course, was the American Civil War, and the absolute devastation is captured by this one number: 600,000 lives lost, as generals like Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee waged total war across the continent. The conflict fundamentally shifted from a war just to preserve the Union into a war to permanently eradicate slavery from the United States. Chapter 6: Reconstruction and the West, a hollow unity. The Union was victorious, yes, but just days after Lee's surrender, President Lincoln was assassinated. So now the government faced this unimaginably monumental task: rebuilding a completely devastated South and integrating millions of newly freed Black Americans into society during the era we call Reconstruction. And there were some incredible legislative triumphs during this time. I mean, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments fundamentally rewrote the Constitution to abolish slavery, grant equal citizenship, and guarantee voting rights. But enforcing those rights, that required federal troops in the South. President Grant even had to create the Justice Department specifically to crush violent white supremacist hate groups like the KKK. But unfortunately, the political will to enforce those rights just didn't last. The contested election of 1876 led to the Compromise of 1877. Basically, to secure the presidency, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. It was a deeply tragic pivot. Civil rights protections were abandoned, ushering in a century of systemic oppression known as Jim Crow, right at the very same time the rest of the country was looking out west, romanticizing outlaws and lawmen like Wyatt Earp in this rapidly expanding, lawless frontier.
So I want to leave you with this question to chew on. The nation was united in name, but at what cost to its most vulnerable citizens? The story from 1492 to 1877 is undeniably one of breathtaking innovation and relentless expansion, but it's also built on profound compromise and very deep scars. Understanding those growing pains is absolutely the key to understanding the America that walks into the Gilded Age, and for sure, the America we live in today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.